seat. After Jesus and his disciples sang hymns, they crossed over the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. And on the Mount of Olives, there's a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. And Gethsemane actually means olive press. And it's because there is actually an olive press there. It still exists today. In Jesus' day, olive oil was made there. And in Jesus' time, the way they made olive oil was pretty low tech. They took a bunch of olives and they would crush them with a stone, so they were kind of just a rough pulp. And then they would take that and put it inside of a linen bag, think kind of like a burlap bag. And then they would place that on a round stone that was flat and had a channel cut in it. They put that bag on there, and then they would press those olives 3 times. And so they would take another round stone weight and place it on top of that bag of olives, and that was the first pressing. And from that first pressing, you get extra virgin olive oil. And in Jesus' day, it was that oil that was used by the priests at the temple, and it was also used to anoint kings because it was the best oil. They would then add a second stone on top of that, and then they had a big wooden beam that they would use to apply additional pressure to that. And that would be the second pressing of the olives. And from that, you would get olive oil that was used for medicinal purposes and for lamps. They used oil lamps back then. And then lastly, there would be the third pressing. And so another stone would be added. And then again, they would press on that wooden beam. And by this time, most of the oil was pressed out of the olives. There was still a little bit left. But what would actually happen now is that the actual olive pits would break. They'd crack. And they were really high in lye. And so if you've ever accidentally bitten into one of those, you understand why it tastes so bad. So because of the high lye content in the oil, that oil was used for cleaning. While they were in the garden, Jesus asked Peter and John and James to go with him and pray. 3 times, Jesus stopped praying because he was under such stress. He was feeling the pressure of what he was about to do. So he stopped 3 times. He was being pressed 3 times, like the olives. And it's because of that that we can say that Jesus is the anointed one. He is king. But he's also our healer and our redeemer. And just like the third cleansing produced an olive oil that was suitable for cleansing, Jesus is the cleanser of our sin. Judas showed up in the garden about midnight, leading a mob. And as he approached Jesus, he betrayed him with a kiss. But what he did was much worse than that. In that time, a student never approached their rabbi or teacher without being invited first, without being spoken to first. And for Judas to walk right up to Jesus and give him that kiss was such a sign of disrespect. The mob then took Jesus and took him to Annas, who was the former high priest. He had been appointed by the Romans, and because the Romans appointed him, they'd also had him step down and appointed his son-in-law later. But because Annas was so powerful, that he still ran things in Jerusalem. So they took Jesus to Annas, and Annas questioned him, "Are you Messiah? Are you the Christ?" And Jesus refused to answer him. They then took Jesus to the true high priest serving them, which was Caiaphas. And they beat him. They pulled the hair out of his beard. And they mocked him. They produced false witnesses. The witnesses couldn't even agree on their stories. They didn't know what they were talking about. But yet, at this illegal trial, and it was illegal because under the law, the Sanhedrin was not allowed to meet except in daytime. But in this mock trial, this illegal trial, they convicted him of blasphemy, which was the highest thing they could convict him of, to result in a death penalty. And so they also gave him the death penalty. But because that could not be done, the sentencing could not be done until daylight, they waited. And so sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, they threw Jesus in a dungeon beneath Caiaphas' house. It's a little more than an old well that was dug into the bedrock beneath his house. I've been in it. There's not a more dark place that you could be. It's there that Jesus spent his last night. At daybreak, they took Jesus out of that well and they took him to Pilate's house. They needed the Romans' approval for a death sentence because they could issue a death sentence, but the Jewish leaders could not carry it out. So they take Jesus to Pilate. And Pilate questions him and can tell right away, something's not right here. This man is not guilty of anything. And so Pilate looks for any reason to get rid of this situation, right? He knows this is a travesty. And so when he finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, he has an out because Galilee is not in his jurisdiction. It's under Herod's control. So he sends him to Herod. Now, Herod was more than likely slightly crazy. And so when Jesus appears before Herod, Herod's not interested in the truth. All he wants is Jesus to perform. Do some tricks for me, Jesus. Tell me some things. And Jesus wouldn't cooperate with him. So Herod lost interest. He sends him back to Pilate. And now Jesus is back standing before Pilate. And Pilate knows, I cannot kill this man. I can't, he's innocent. He's done nothing. Pilate understands what's happening. And so he thinks, I'll beat him and I'll have him scourged in front of the people. Maybe that will satisfy them. Maybe that will back them down from wanting him to be crucified. So Jesus is stripped. He's tied to a pole. 2 soldiers on either side of him have an instrument called the flagellum. Its sole purpose is to rip the flesh from the person it hits. So they take turns, one on either side, ripping the flesh off of his back. Now, because this was punishment, they didn't really care where it landed. And so it would have caught him on the back of the head, or on the back of his legs. Most victims of a scourging like that don't survive because of the trauma and the blood loss. See, the Romans were professionals. They'd been doing that. They'd been killing people for a long time. They knew exactly what they were doing. Before that, Jesus endured another mock trial and more beatings. In the Praetorium, which is where the Roman soldiers were garrisoned there in Jerusalem. It's at the Antonia Fortress, which is right next to the Temple Mount. It still exists today as well. They beat Jesus with their fists and with clubs, and they mocked him. On the floor, this cobblestone floor of the Antonia Fortress, carved into the stone, there's what basically amounts to a game board. A game was played called the Game of Kings. And when we read what was happening with Jesus, when they gave him a mock scepter and a crown of thorns and a robe, they were playing the Game of Kings because they rolled dice to see who got to do what. If you rolled this, well then you get to beat him. If you roll this, you can crown him. If you roll this, well you have to kneel before him. So if you go to Jerusalem today, you can see that Game of Kings still etched in the stone. Jesus was beaten and scourged until he was hardly recognizable. Not unrecognizable as in, is that Jesus? But unrecognizable as in, is that a human or an animal? They couldn't tell. He was a bloody mess. Pilate, one last time, tries to avoid having to kill Jesus. And he tries to appease him. Hey, it's Passover. In recognition of that, I'll release a prisoner to you. Do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas? Barabbas had been arrested for leading a revolt, a revolution. The very thing that people thought Jesus was going to do as Messiah. And so when Pilate gave them that choice, they yelled, "Barabbas, give us Barabbas." Because I'm sure they were thinking, at least he's tried to do something to get rid of the Romans. What has Jesus done? Jesus has done nothing yet. It's now about 8 a.m. and Pilate finally agrees to crucify Jesus. So Jesus is forced to carry the beam of his cross through the streets of Jerusalem and out the Damascus Gate. It's called the Damascus Gate because the road to Damascus runs right by that gate. It's a very public place. We think of the crucifixion taking place on this very large, high hill in the middle of nowhere. It took place right outside of the city walls. It doesn't do any good to punish people if nobody can see it. The Romans send a message with crucifixion. This is what happens to you when you go against the Roman authority. And so Jesus, 2 other men were crucified there on a hill called Golgotha, which means the skull. This place still exists today as well. If you go to Jerusalem, you'll know it when you see it. You'll see 2 eyes and a nose on the face of a skull. It's a natural occurrence on the side of a hill. Unfortunately, today there is a bus station right below it, and there's a parking lot on top of it. But when you see it, you will know that is the place. Jesus hangs on the cross for 6 hours. Pain shooting through his body. Pain from the scourging. The nerve endings exposed on his back as he's pressed up against that cross. The pain from those large iron spikes being driven through his wrist, through his feet. The religious leaders, Roman soldiers, common people, even the thieves hanging on the cross with him, continue to hurl insults at Jesus. Around noon, it became dark. The gospel writers tell us that the sun basically was blotted out. The very people, the nation of Israel, that rejected the light of the world were now subjected to darkness. It was creation mourning its creator. Around 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he did that as the wrath of God was poured out on him. For you, for me. Sins of the past, and sins of the present, and sins of the future. All covered by the same blood that was spilling down that cross. And finally, with a shout of victory, Jesus shouted, "It is finished." It's finished. What he set out to do was finished. Sin and death were conquered. The gospel writers tell us that the earth shook and rocks were split in half. The veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. Creation was mourning the loss of the Son of God. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. And he hurriedly wrapped it in linen strips and put it in his own tomb. And he hurriedly did that because the Sabbath was coming. And so he couldn't be around a dead body. He had to be home So hurriedly, he puts him in a borrowed tomb. If we were Jesus' disciples, then what we've been thinking? Most of the 11 that were left were so scared, they were nowhere to be found. And we would have been scared too. Picture you today as a disciple of Jesus. Put yourself in their shoes. The man that we followed for 3 years. The one who we thought that was God's chosen one, has just been killed in the worst imaginable way possible. He was killed in a way that's reserved for the worst criminals. Is that how it ends for God's chosen one? As his followers, what are we to do? I mean, if they did that to Jesus, what will they do to us? We need to hide. What does all this mean?